Who wrote the Bible? What is the Torah? What are the differences between the Old Testament and the New Testament? In this video, I'll break it all down, giving you a clear understanding of this sacred text, its origin, structure, and historical development. Mainly, I wanted to make this video so that in future videos, when I reference the Tanakh or the Torah, Hebrew Bible, you guys will know what I'm talking about. The word Bible comes from the Greek ta biblia, meaning the books or the scrolls. Over time, Latin treated it as a singular noun, biblia, and then it gradually became the English word Bible. There are 66 books in the Bible, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament. However, I think a clear representation of the bulk of the Old Testament is that it comprises around 77% of the entire Bible, with only 23% for the New Testament. For reference, it took me about 3.5 years to deeply read the Old Testament, while it only took me about 3 months to read the New Testament. It also probably speaks to the differences in complexity between the two compositions. When Christians talk about the Old Testament and the New Testament, they usually mean that God made an old covenant with Israel, Testament, covenant, and then a new covenant with the entire world through Jesus. However, Judaism rejects the New Testament. Why? Well, there are multiple reasons, but simply, it doesn't meet the standards used to determine which books belong in the Hebrew Bible. And also, Judaism rejects the idea that God ever terminated his covenant with Israel. In fact, in the Torah, it states repeatedly that the covenant is eternal. But this is for a different video. What is the Torah, though, exactly? The word Torah usually means law or instruction, but it's also connected to the word ora, meaning light. Torah can have a generic meaning, referring to any work of Judaism containing spiritual thought and direction. But it also more popularly refers to the first 5 books of Moses, otherwise known as the Pentateuch. These are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They're the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Tradition holds that at Mount Sinai in the year 1313 BCE, Moses received Genesis up until Exodus 20. And then the rest of the 5 books were revealed as events unfolded while the Israelites were in the desert over the 40 years before they entered the land of Canaan. Now let's talk about the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible comprises all of those books that are in the Old Testament, except Orthodox Jews don't call it the Old Testament. Instead, they commonly refer to it as the Tanakh. And Tanakh is an acronym. It actually helps us understand how the Hebrew Bible is partitioned. T in Tanakh refers to Torah. The N in Tanakh refers to Nevi'im, which in Hebrew means prophets. The Ch at the end refers to the Ketuvim, which in Hebrew means writings. The difference between these 3 groupings is based on their nature and degree of divine revelation. The Torah has the highest degree of revelation because Moses went up to Mount Sinai in front of the entire nation of Israel, and he received revelation while he was awake. In the Nevi'im, the prophets, that's a step down because the prophets usually received visions in their sleep and then wrote it down while they were awake. And the Ketuvim, the writings, were written with divine inspiration. In general, Torah is the law. The Nevi'im contains the words of those prophets who were sent to admonish Israel for their disobedience, but also encourage them for the difficult times ahead, put simply. And then the Ketuvim, the writings, contain history, philosophy, poetry, and advice for successful living. Now let's talk about how they were compiled. Hezekiah and his court compiled many of the already written books. But the Great Assembly in the 4th century BCE compiled, edited, redacted, and canonized the majority of the Hebrew Bible. However, some sources suggest that books like the Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes were debated until about the 1st century CE. Yet by the 4th century BCE, prophecy was thought to have ended, and so the Great Assembly took on the task. But who were the Great Assembly exactly? The Great Assembly were the 120 Jewish leaders who were part of the Jewish High Court, otherwise known as the Sanhedrin, in the 4th century BCE. This governing body did many things to standardize and strengthen Jewish observance and practice. According to the Talmud, which is part of the Jewish oral tradition, the Great Assembly apparently had so many prophecies that they only chose the ones that they thought may be of benefit for future generations, and those are the ones that they put into the Hebrew Bible. Now, it's important to note that the original Tanakh did not have any verses or punctuation, and it was actually originally written in Hebrew. And Hebrew is a language that doesn't have any capitalization. So keep this stuff in mind when you're reading an English translation of the Old Testament. For by definition, you are reading another individual's or group's rendition of the original God's word. I have seen how translations have doctored the original text to help fit their worldview, but this is perhaps for another video. So the Hebrew Bible was complete for multiple centuries before Jesus arrived. Indeed, prophecy had departed by the mid-5th century BCE. The New Testament, though, is also partitioned. Simply, it contains 4 Gospels, which document Jesus' late life, and 2 include his birth, and Paul's letters, which are usually addressed to leaders of newly formed churches concerning theological matters and how the church should conduct itself. So Jesus presumably died around the year 30 of the Common Era. The earliest work that we have from the New Testament are Paul's letters in about 50 CE. Scholars believe the Gospels to have started with Mark in the year about 70 CE, and then Matthew from 80 to 90 CE, and then Luke from 85 to 95, and then John from about 90 to 110. And I also must note that Jesus' divinity follows this chronological progression, with John being the most theological gospel and Mark being the least. Now, Paul never physically met Jesus, yet his works are the earliest on the chronological timeline of the New Testament. And unlike many of the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, where they explicitly hold their statements in the first person, the Gospels are written in third person, so we don't actually know who wrote them. For example, the book of Matthew never says, "Hey guys, I'm Matthew, I witnessed everything that Jesus did." Instead, it actually writes about Matthew in the third person. These are just names attributed to the works by the early church fathers. Additionally, the New Testament is written in Greek. Despite Jesus and his disciples speaking Aramaic, the entire original New Testament is written in Greek. Now, there are many other points that I'm leaving out because that's not the purpose of this video, but let's go into how it was canonized. The canonization of the New Testament was a long and gradual process. Early Christians debated which writings were authoritative, especially in light of theological disputes like those concerning the nature of Jesus. Over centuries, church leaders debated and refined the canon, with key milestones in the 4th century. The councils of Rome, Hippo, and Carthage basically canonized the New Testament as we know it today. On a more personal note, when I happened upon the New Testament after reading the Hebrew Bible, it was immediately apparent to me that the collection is a completely separate work and should be treated as such, not as an attachment to the Hebrew Bible like it is today. I can't begin to describe all of the errors, inconsistencies, and manipulations I found. And I can make videos on this if you guys would like. But for one, I don't want to become an anti-Christianity channel. And second, there are already really good resources that I will link in the video description. I hope this video helped further your understanding of the Bible. Next week is going to be an extremely special video, so subscribe to stay tuned. Thank you guys for watching.